Now that we've seen how to test simple services, let's learn how to test a slightly more complex service. This service, the user data service, has one dependency, the user resource service. It has three functions, getUser, save, and users, and each of those utilizes user resource. So in order to learn how to test a service like this, let's write some tests for getUser and for save. Looking at getUser, it does essentially one thing. It calls userResource.get and returns that value. So let's write two tests, one that tests each of those aspects. Now, since I'm going to be writing tests for two different functions, I'm going to make this a little bit easier myself, and I'm going to separate them out in their own describes. Now that I got a describe for getUser, I'm going to write the tests for getUser inside of that. Now remember, I have to call inject in order to get an instance of my user data function. And then I'll take the important action on the user data service, which is to call getUser. And let's pass in Bob as the username. Now, since user data internally calls user resource, and I want to test what parameters it calls user resource with, I know I'm going to need a mock user resource. So I'm going to set up an expectation that utilizes a mock user resource. And I'm going to check that the first argument of the first call is an object that has a username of Bob. I use toEqual here instead of toBe so that it doesn't check identity, but instead just checks that the objects are equivalent and have the same properties with the same values. Now the next problem I need to solve is that I don't actually have a mock user resource object. So I'm going to create that in a before each. And since the variable has to be accessible both in the before each and in the it, I'm going to define that variable outside of them both. Now the user resource object has one function that I care about, and that's get. Okay, now I've created the mock user resource object, but the user data object, when it gets constructed by Angular, is still going to use the real user resource service that I created in my application and not this mock one. So I need to tell Angular that when the user data service asks for a user resource service, to use my mock instead of the actual service. And the way that I do that is by getting a hold of Angular's provide object. And in order to get a hold of the provide object, I call the module function and pass in a function. The provide object has a value function, and that value function takes in two parameters, the name of the service and the value that should be provided whenever anybody asks for that service. By calling this line of code right here, I've told Angular that whenever anybody asks for a user resource object, to use my mock user resource instead. And now that I've got that set up, I've got one last piece to do, and that is to invoke the module. Now that I got those in place, I can save and run the file. And now that that's ran, you can see that the new test is passing also. Okay, let's write another test for getUser. Looking at the getUser function, we can see that it returns whatever userResource.get returns. So let's just verify that with the test. So I'm calling getUser and capturing the output. I want to expect that output is some known value. So now I just need to tell my mock user resource to return the string Angular rocks. All right, let's save that and see what we get. Okay, that test is passing too. Now that we've got those two tests going, let's write one more test. We'll write this one for the save function. So I'm going to go after my describe and write a new describe. And I'm going to go look at the save function, and I can see that it calls userResource.save with whatever value you pass in. So let's just write a test for that. Okay, so I've called userdata.save, and I've created an expectation that the mock user resources save function was called with that same value. Let's save, and that will run our tests and see what we get. Okay, we're getting a failure, so let's look at it and see what the problem is. All right, our error is that the object has no method save. Well, the object it's trying to call save on is my user resource object, which in my test is the mock user resource object. So if I go up in my test, we can see that I've only defined a get function for my mock user resource object and not a save function. All right, now that I've got a save function defined, let's try running this test again. Okay, now our test is passing. So there's a great example of how to test a service that has a dependency and be able to provide a mock dependency. Whenever we're testing services, we always want to use mock dependencies for all the dependencies on our service so that we're testing our service in isolation. That way, whenever any tests for any of our services break, we know that what broke was the service and not one of its dependencies.